Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Being last is the worst place in the day, so I'll try and speed along. There was a question about land from a lady over there. I was involved in the land and planning part of the Ghana study. Tomorrow afternoon, I think tomorrow, I'm not sure what time, there's a session on the project that looked at land and planning in Mozambique. So there'll be another opportunity to discuss the land issue, which for me as an urban planner is the key one. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to share my talk with Nandini Dasgupta, my partner in this research. Charles, could you, Charles, or Charles, could you? We'll never get it the right way around. Dr. Muti from UTRC in Kampala was our local partner, and if there are any queries about the actual work that we did in field work we did in Uganda, he can also answer questions. So I'm just going to quickly set the context. The challenges and opportunities as we identified them in a fairly short period, but fairly intense field research that we did in Uganda. Speak up, okay. The first point really to be made is that the problem of attitudes towards the informal economy. And in general, informalization is regarded as a problem by city authorities, by governments. And the main response is to try and control it, to restrict it. However, we have to keep in mind that the informal economy accounts for, right across Africa, quite a large proportion of the value added in urban areas. One estimate is that the estimate we have for Uganda is 43% of GDP is provided by the urban economy, the informal economy, 70% of employment. Across Africa as a whole, it could be as much as 55% of GDP and 80% of employment. So, in a way, it's kind of daft, in my view, to disregard this huge part of the economy and just assume that it's going to go away. This is our starting point for our research, really. One of the sort of theoretical views of it is that it's something that is ephemeral, is going to go away. Our finding is that, in fact, it's likely to stay and possibly grow. And then we have to think about its particular role. So, for example, informal activities support the consumption of habits of constant habits of those on higher incomes, providing services, cheap goods, and so on, and also cheap inputs into the formal economy. So, in a way, the informal economy is also subsidizing the formal part of the economy. This is a very important point to keep in mind. Then there are the challenges that the informal economy faces: access to the factors of production, infrastructure, services, finance. They're basically starved of these essential issues, essential factors. So, as a consequence, creating, sustaining and expanding channels for markets for informal economy products and services is very difficult and costly, and often the value of informal enterprises production is captured further up the value chain. So we have to start to try and understand how the informal economy fits into the larger urban economy, and that was really the thrust of our research. Obviously things like skills training, business development support is usually missing. So what did we find in the Uganda case study? We started to look at how do you define the informal economy. We started with the ILOs. The ILO has done a lot of work with Llyod on defining how the informal economy should be measured. And essentially it's defined as workers and entrepreneurs who are not recognized or protected under national legal and regulatory framework. So how did we go about reconceptualizing the informal economy? Essentially building on work that others have done, we envisaged it as a continuum between the formal and the informal parts of the overall economy. If you like, a hybrid economy that brings together both of those elements. And we looked at, in our research, at informal enterprises, but rather than use the normal term of the informal sector, we moved away to think of the informal economy as something that comprises many different sectors and forms the lower part of this continuum between a formal and informal economy. So many sectors, people working in many different fields, but with links to the formal economy, quite complicated links sometimes, and also cross-linkages across the different sectors. That was our starting concept. So I'll hand over to Nandini, who's going to talk about the field research we did and the findings of our study in Uganda. We need to look at this gap in the size. It's essentially looking at the size of enterprises. There's a massive number of small enterprises, usually sole operators, a very small number of very large enterprises, and a big gap in the middle of medium and small and medium-sized enterprises that are employing people. So one of the things we're looking at is how, at the bottom end, enterprises can be moved forward to fill this gap in the middle. Okay. So next slide, please.
Okay. One of the most important arguments that we have in our study is really to establish that the informal economy is an integral part of the modern urban economic growth. And this is very important because there is an institutional perception that the informal economy will disappear or shrink with growth. But now to establish that, we had to do some basic field research. Also, we needed to deconstruct the informal economy because there is hardly any data, except for some data which has been collected by ACT Together and some other organizations. There is very little information and data on the informal economy, the people who work and what they do and how they do it. So we did a three-staged field work, but we first had to choose the cities. Our brief was to look at the secondary cities because those are the cities which are growing much faster than Kampala. So we had a set of criteria and we whittled it down to 5 secondary cities, and they included 5 in the 5 different regions of Uganda. And they were Arua, Mbarara, Hoima, Jinja, and Mbale. Thank you, Mbale. And so we did a rapid survey of all these cities, and then we analyzed that data and chose Mbarara and Mbale for in-depth study based on questionnaires. Next slide, please. Why did we choose these 2 cities? We chose these 2 cities because in our initial survey, we found that Mbarara is a city which was receiving considerable government investments, and also it had received, private investment was also moving in, and in the rural economy, the dairying industry had improved under some aid programs. So that was a fast-growing economy. It was growing much faster than the other one in the eastern region. That was growing more with the natural growth. Can we go back to the previous one, please? Yeah. So what we did, if the traditional thinking is if a city is growing, the informal sector will decline. But our estimates show that the size of the informal economy in Ambarara is much bigger, and on top of that, it is generating more income for its workers, in fact, 60% more than in the slow-growing city. Next. Again, to emphasize our point, we said, okay, let's look at it in the context of the regional growth. If we look at the bars, which are in red and black, black is the western region where Ambarara is situated, and the red is the eastern region, which is where the deprivation levels are pretty high. And so in this case, if the regional disparity and deprivation levels have declined, if they have declined, then our informal economy should also decline. But it's not. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. So what is feeding this informal economy? I have tried to conceptualize it. I've lost the pointer, I'm afraid. At the core of this diagram is the kind of economic and industrial growth that's taking place. It is resource intensive. That means it's not that there is no industrial growth, there is, but the focus is on industries like oil, energy, information systems, which does not create a lot of employment opportunities. It creates jobs, yes. The other impact it has on the urban economy is that this growth has a multiplier effect on the urban system. And a World Bank study showed that this multiplier effect can be almost 1.6%, which is pretty high. So what you have, because of this kind of resource-intensive growth, you've got two impacts. One is the multiplier effect, and the other is a small demand for jobs. But the expectations in the job markets are much higher. So more people move to the urban areas where there is growth. A small number will get some jobs, get a job in the industrial economy. The bulk will move down. And so where will they go? They will try and join the informal economy because of the ease of entry. Some will go to the higher part of the urban continuum that we are talking about. Some entrepreneurs who can be local, regional, or national will try and join this growing economy. And you will also have survivalists, or the poor. ILO used this term in 1972 when we started talking about the informal economy. So what is fueling this informal economy? We've been talking of a growing urbanization, growing informal economy. What we are arguing here is that it is being fed by 3 or more different groups. And they're each coming with their own resources, with their own skill sets, education, socioeconomic background, age, gender. And each of these factors or conditions are adding to the heterogeneity of the sector, which has made it very difficult to develop policy options because it's made up of so many different groups. So, next slide, please. So the next question is, so all these people are going into the informal economy. Are they making a viable living? The 3 points I want to extract from this chart. One, the green line is the poverty line because In Uganda, we haven't got a minimum wage level, so we've had to use the poverty line. The red is Mbale, and the other one is Mbarara, the town which is growing. You can see that there are more people below poverty line in the slow-growing city, but in Mbarara, there are, of course, people, survivalists, but they're of a smaller proportion. Now, what is important here is this third group, which is 36% in 10. Why? Because according to the poverty debates and definitions, they are described as transient poor. That means, they're doing all right most of the time, but there's a wedding or a death or a loss of job or something happens and they tip back into poverty. So this group is much bigger. This group of transient poor is much bigger in an economy which is not growing very fast. Whereas you can see that the distribution in Mbarara is skewed more towards the better off. The third point, if I can just draw your attention to the figures over here. I need more than 3 minutes. In Mbale, you can see that most people are struggling along. But what is interesting is that the women in Mbarara are earning more than the men. This is against or contrary to the gender narrative, because women usually in the informal economy don't do well. So what does this mean? Slide. Can I have the next slide? So what does this mean? Is it that the women in Mbarara are the winners? Not really. Next slide. So who is gaining from this urban growth that's taking place? And just to quickly show, I've given you the sectors in Mbarara. Those sectors in the street trading, we're looking at street trading, I didn't mention that, those trades which give more income, and all those are dominated by women. So they are competing successfully. These are the positive things we've got to take out of this. Now, again, the traditional narrative tells us women are unable to put in as many hours and days as men because of their joint commitments for at home and at work, productivity and reproduction. But here, they are working just as many hours and days as the men. Next slide. Okay. So they're at a sort of fairly level footing. If you look at this graph, it shows it's a predominantly young population in Mbarara, and men are leaving the sector after about an average of 6.7, whereas women are staying in the sector longer. So this raises the question, is it because they are coming with less or lower levels of educational skills? Shall we see what their educational skills are? Come on. They're not. They actually, if you look, they are pretty good. They're almost at the same level as the men. And in fact, when it comes to technical education, they are doing better. So what does this lead us to argue? What I'm arguing here is that women are grabbing the opportunities that have been given. Some of them, can we have the next slide? Some of them are equally or better educated, but the opportunities that they are unable to access the opportunities as much as the men are able to do. What is constricting them? What is constraining them? And so women with same education are stuck in the informal economy, whereas the men are able to move out more easily. And this leads us to one of our main arguments, is that it's very important to mainstream gender in urban economic development. And the last point is, women, we find, were also in sectors like selling mobile phones and telephone accessories. Now, this also means that, we could improve the lot of women if we train them give them the skills in the sectors which are growing rather than in the more traditional sectors like, say, for example, basket weaving, for which the demand is declining. So we really need to change our mindset in the way we should produce help or training skills for women. And my last point is, please, next slide. Yeah. The last thing is, I sort of said there's a lot of heterogeneity and diversity in the sector, in the economy, which makes it difficult to develop policies. So we also tried to develop a methodology which would enable us to identify target groups for policy interventions as points of entry. Conceptually, you can to develop a methodology, we have to have a conceptual framework. And there are two types of diversity or heterogeneity. One is vertical, the other is horizontal. Put simply, vertical means the different socioeconomic layers that we have, the employers down to the wage labor. And the horizontal diversity is introduced by the different sectors these groups are working in. So this was first, we build on the work done by Martha Chen. Next slide, please. This is Martha Chen's model, where she, after covering about 6 different empirical studies, she has this pyramid, where she's saying the top is dominated by small number of entrepreneurs, the bottom is by unpaid home workers. And women at the bottom, the top is dominated by men, which is true. Now, what we are saying is that just looking at this kind of division is very useful, but it will not help us to identify analytical groups. We need to build, next slide please, we need to build this pyramid for all the different, or whichever the relevant types of activity that is taking place. Because the shape of this pyramid will vary according to the sector of activity. And to show that, we've deconstructed can we have the next slide, please? So this is for street trading, and that's for brick making. So if we want to move the brick-making industry from inside Ambarara, who are the groups which we should be looking at? How should we identify them? How do we go about developing policy options for them? So this is one, I think, a major contribution this study has made, is not only have we theoretically established that the informal sector will continue to grow, even though urban economic growth is taking place, some kind of industrial growth is taking place, and also we've sort of taken a step forward in trying to establish a methodology. Now, this is just the first step. We need to do a lot more work to refine it.
Okay. There's no time to do this now. Believe it or not, the output of our research is a research agenda. This slideshow is available, so you're very welcome to look at it. Can you move to the end, please?
Last slide.
One of the main points about the research agenda is the one about. Sorry, one of the main points about the research agenda is the one about informal governance, working with organisations, communities, in order to develop the informal economy. But this is our, if you like, our statement of intent. Policies aimed at meeting the challenges of the informal economy and supporting its increasing productivity can contribute to transitioning the urban economy in Africa into the engine of growth, creating higher quality jobs and promoting a prosperous and inclusive society. And we would like to take this work forward on that basis. Thank you.